Hey everyone. So I just want to talk about this buzzword that a lot of people are talking about called microdosing. So many of you have probably heard of this if you're following what's going on in the psychedelic space. And there's a lot of hype around the benefits of microdosing, and I think it's a really attractive option for people wanting to try psychedelics to hopefully help with things like depression and anxiety and being able to function in the world given all of that. And I know a lot of people identify pretty strongly with microdosing and will tell you that it really, really helps them. And I am not here to discount anybody's lived experience with microdosing. I think it's great that people are able to find alternative ways of healing where kind of big pharma and our massive healthcare for profit system has been failing us in providing us with real solutions to complex problems that we're faced with, like depression, PTSD, anxiety, among other things, just kind of keeping it within the mental health space. Because I think that's where most people are talking about its benefits. I did a news piece recently for CBS that aired around trying to kind of debunk the hype around microdosing simply because, from a scientific standpoint, the research shows that microdosing doesn't seem to be any better than what we would call a placebo effect. And I just want to break down what that means for people, because that doesn't mean that nothing's happening, and that doesn't mean that people aren't legitimately feeling better. A placebo effect is really just trying to dampen down people's expectations or their belief that they feel better because somebody tells them a drug or a treatment will make them feel better. So typically when we talk about all these clinical trials that are being done with all different drugs that we have access to, but, obviously this is a psychedelic community. So in thinking about how to run that through the clinical trial process with psychedelics, the gold standard for determining does this work to help people feel better beyond this kind of placebo expectation effect, we really need to be able to test that to objectively say, from a scientific standpoint, this psychedelic medicine is better at reducing people's symptoms of depression or PTSD compared to a placebo, where people don't know if they're getting the placebo or not, theoretically. And so if they truly believe that they're going to get better, then they'll feel better. And we need to be able to test whether the drug itself can make people feel better beyond that kind of expectation or belief that they'll get better. And that's really what the placebo effect is. And I think it's an interesting thing, and it's more kind of in the scientific realm of really being able to objectively say to a certain amount of confidence or specificity that something does in fact move the needle on a health symptom like depression. The reason this is so important is, like, even in just regular depression trials with your standard SSRIs or antidepressants that people are taking, the placebo effect usually impacts results to about 40%. 40% of people will claim that they feel better that are in the placebo group. Mostly in depression trials is where I've seen this, where there's just a huge placebo effect because there's a huge kind of mind-body component to mental health conditions that don't have a strong, as far as we can tell, biological basis for what's driving symptoms, like maybe some genetic disorders or sort of kind of more physical disabilities that are due to some kind of physical abnormality, versus something that's more what we would call psychogenic, where it kind of originates in the mind. And not to disparage the whole kind of saying of like it's all in your head. It's like, sure, it is in your head because your head contains your brain, and your brain controls everything in your body. And there's a really strong mind-body connection. And so I don't think we fully understand what really drives mental health issues and things like depression. I think with PTSD, it's a little bit more straightforward. There was a life-threatening situation, and people have adapted sort of in a bad way that has made it so that they're now having this chronic illness and other health complications because of the chronic stress. This can also happen in depression, and I think just this 40% placebo effect that we generally see speaks to the fact that if people really believe they can get better, something inside of us can initiate that healing process even without some drugs. Simply just believing that we can get better, a lot of people do end up feeling better, and I think that's what's driving a lot of this improvement that we're seeing with microdosing. And so while the science is saying it's no better than placebo, I don't think we should discount the fact that the mind-body connection exists. I encourage people to look up a book by Bruce Lipton called The Biology of Belief, and how our thoughts and beliefs can actually impact the way that our biology works. It's a real thing. So I don't want anyone to feel like, saying that placebo effects or microdosing, doesn't work just because science can't prove it using the kind of traditional methods and statistics and things like that. So that's just sort of the scientific and medical community's way to make sure that we're not making claims that aren't objectively measurable and verifiable, because this leads to, what are doctors allowed to prescribe? What are insurance companies allowed to pay for? Because there's been some documented proof that this thing does work better than people just hoping that they'll feel better. And when there's a lot of money involved, there's a lot of effort to make sure that those types of things are legitimate, they're credible, they're rigorously developed, and they can be replicated very easily using similar methods or techniques, so that we know this is, to the best of our ability, given the current technology and state of the science, what we believe to be true to the best of our ability. It's very hard to demonstrate causality typically in a lot of these scientific studies, and usually you'll see something of a p-value less than 0.05. That just means that about 95% of the time we would be able to predict that this thing does happen given all of these conditions. So when things are done well and that number is achieved, then we can say with less than 5% error that this is true. And that's all that's really trying to say. But we're not really able to capture that objectively, rigorously, repeatedly when it comes to lived experience or anecdotes. I think if you have enough anecdotes and people saying, hey, I took this and it made me feel better, that's a real phenomenon. It just doesn't meet the high bar of, what we would consider to be this term called efficacy, which is, does this perform better than a placebo, and to what extent? So, yeah, I know people are really excited about microdosing, and I think it has potential to help ease people into what being on a psychedelic is like. But, just to kind of out myself as a proponent of the macrodose, most psychedelics like LSD, magic mushrooms, are exceedingly physically safe, assuming you don't have some kind of underlying heart condition. And there's this term of, beware the dreaded underdose, because if you're trying to really go deep on a psychedelic, it can be a little counterproductive if you don't quite take enough where you're still kind of able to have control over the situation and avoid going into difficult subject matter that your subconscious might bring up. And so, a lot of people, I'm not advocating for people to go out and take massive amounts of psychedelics, but to really, really get past our own kind of innate barriers that our consciousness has set up to prevent us from experiencing pain and suffering, we kind of need to shake things up a bit. And you really only get that on the larger doses. Beyond that, I feel like microdosing can help people with symptom management. It can help people function on the day-to-day, though I don't think anybody should be microdosing every day. There are some dangers in repeatedly activating your serotonin receptors. You do have serotonin receptors in your muscle tissue. Specifically, the one that's most at risk is those in the heart muscle. So I don't know that the science around the frequency and what the true risk is to people's cardiovascular function is when it comes to microdosing, and how often it should be done and how often it can be done to actually achieve benefit. So yeah, I just want folks to kind of know that that's kind of where I'm at. I might be biased, but I do try to follow the science as best as I can, while also understanding that the science really isn't able to fully grapple with what's actually happening in the culture around psychedelics. And I don't know that, myself, I don't need the scientific method to prove to me that psychedelics work and that they help me feel better and they help me with my own spiritual connection. But regulators do, and lawmakers do, and physicians do. So it's a high mark to hit that I don't know that the way that psychedelics work is really ever going to convince true skeptics, because I don't think it can be fit into this kind of scientific method very neatly. Because there's so much going on with psychedelics that I don't think science has the tools to measure. I mean, when we talk about the religious or spiritual components of psychedelics, I don't think that's something science can even touch or grapple with or have a methodology to understand beyond what we would call qualitative research, which is just sort of how can we understand the themes and the phenomenon that are coming up and what is consistently seen. And, I think art is a really good way of looking at what's happening, people's sort of artistic representations through music or paintings or digital art. So yeah, I don't know if any of that made sense, but I got a lot of sort of very strong reactions to a recent CBS News story about microdosing and sort of likening it to taking an antidepressant. And I know people have had really bad experiences on antidepressants, and I don't think that sort of from a symptom management point of view that they are exactly the same. But I do think that it's similar in the way that it's being used, and that people are taking something frequently to keep their symptoms manageable so they can function, they can go to work, they can interact with their family, do the things that they need to do to be considered functional in society, while really not actually curing what's going on. And so I think we see this with SSRIs where, people take them for a long time, they help for a while, and after a while people build up a tolerance, or it's even at some point kind of dangerous to get off of them. I think there's been spikes in suicidal behavior when people abruptly stop taking SSRIs when they've been on them for a really long time. So, and we don't even actually know what SSRIs are doing. We don't understand the mechanisms for what they're doing, and they're so widely prescribed for so many things. Even though they're an antidepressant, they're given for a lot of stuff because they impact serotonin, and that's one of the major neurotransmitters in our brain and our body. So it's a very blunt tool that really doesn't cure somebody. If it's something that you have to take every day for the rest of your life, that's symptom management. That's not a cure. I truly believe that very high dose, deep psychedelic experiences are where that cure is possible, but it's also a very scary place to navigate. And so I think it should be explored with some skepticism and understanding your own mind and how you react to psychedelics. And in that vein, I think that's where microdosing can help people kind of feel acclimated to what it looks like and sort of incrementally increasing the dose. But at some point, you got to really just dive in head first and do the work and do the inner work, which I'll tell you, I've had a lot of really bad trips. And I know a lot of people like to stay away from that term bad trips, but there are legitimate bad trips, and I've had quite a few for being in the wrong setting, not kind of knowing how much I was taking, things like that. So, but I've taken a lot of psychedelics in my life, and I can tell you I always come out of the other end stronger and a little bit more capable of being able to handle going in. But I'm always scared to take them, and I'm always scared to do those higher doses because it really does bring up a lot of material in your subconscious that can be just objectively terrifying. I mean, it takes all of your worst fears and manifests them in this fantastical altered state of consciousness, visions. And sometimes you're put up against this, like, what feels like a literal life or death situation within the context of your worst fears being manifested. So it's not something to be taken lightly. And if you are prone to spirituality or religious experiences, it can be very, very, very scary in that context. But I think at the end of the day, it's worth it. And it helps us, at least it's helped me, loosen my fear around trying things that seem scary, because I'm not sure what's going to happen. And I'm a bit of a control freak at times, and it really has helped me to relax my need to control everything, because on a high enough dose of psychedelics, you have zero control. And the challenge there is being able to surrender to that uncertainty and not trying to control it, because the more you try to control it, the scarier it gets, the harder it gets. And it really is just about kind of surrendering and relaxing into the experience and letting it be what it is. And having a guide there can help. Some people really value that. Personally, I don't like having another person with me, because they tend to kind of personify whatever it is I'm struggling with, and I don't like projecting my stuff onto people if I can avoid it. But I do recognize that there are times when it's very scary, and if I'm literally thinking I'm dying, it's helpful if somebody's there being like, you're not actually dying, I got you, your heart rate's fine. There's nothing going on with you. It's kind of all in your subconscious, and you're not actually physically dying, just some part of you is dying. And that's still a real experience to have to go through, but I think we can get better at it. And that's all I'll say about that. Just wanted to kind of lay out the realities of, what is macrodosing? What is microdosing? What is science able to tell us about that? And what can we still learn? And I think there's still a lot that we need to learn. But I'm kind of at a point where I don't understand why we need to know how these work if we can just demonstrate that they're safe and they're not hurting people, and people have instructions for how to engage responsibly and safely with the best practices developed by many, many cultures, including the more modern hippie counterculture. I think people should be able to access them, and it shouldn't be a crime. But that's a whole nother conversation. So yeah, thanks for listening.